A miracle rescue in the Amazon jungle. 4 children found alive after a tireless search by the Colombian military. How did they survive for 40 days after vanishing in a small plane crash?
Buried under some of the thickest green jungles, flashes of metal stopped a search team in their tracks. At first it looked like scrap, until the jungle opened and they saw the outline of planes no one had laid eyes on for more than 80 years. Inside waited clues that rewrote wartime records and rocked the families tied to the mission.
We have found Richard Bong's Marge P-38 airplane, the most famous fighter airplane from World War II. I assumed somebody had found it already, and I was just going to track down that documentation that it had been found.
Today, we're counting down the most haunting plane discoveries ever found, starting with the one that proves the jungle never forgets. What they found inside will stay with you. Each discovery began the same way. Shadows of metal where none should be. Relics swallowed by time, yet waiting to be uncovered. But as searchers drew closer, it became clear these were not just wrecks. They were graves, mysteries, and silent witnesses to stories the world had almost forgotten. Number 10. Discovery of Marge. A flash of aluminum appeared where nothing should have been, and it stopped people cold. What looked at first like a twisted wingtip soon resolved into a P-38 Lightning. Marge, the twin-boom fighter named for a pilot's sweetheart, Marge Vattendahl. This identification mattered because the P-38 was a high-profile warplane tied to famous names like top ace Richard Bong, and because this particular aircraft had been missing since World War II. This decades-old disappearance was a cold case, a wartime loss recorded in logs and whispered about in local photos and memory, but never verified on the ground. Here is what is believed to have happened. On March 24, 1944, Second Lieutenant Thomas Malone was flying Marge on a weather mission when the plane gave out and he had to bail. Though Malone survived the jump, the Lightning did not. And for years, rumors, old photos, and local memories pointed researchers toward that Madang ravine. In May of 2024, more than 80 years after the aircraft vanished, an expedition stitched together archival records, faded photographs, local oral history, and the groundwork laid by Pacific Rex, then cut a path through the vines. As the team cleared the canopy, the P-38's twin booms and engines reappeared, their surfaces mottled with rust and peeling red paint. A stenciled number, 993, matched wartime paperwork exactly, turning rumor into verification. Over the several days, the searchers cataloged serial numbers, photographed each fragment in high resolution, and mapped the debris field with Global Positioning System, also known as GPS, so specialists could reconstruct the loss and advise on conservation. For Malone's family, the documentation offered hard evidence and a choice about commemoration, while for historians it resolved a long-standing gap in the record. In short, the jungle yielded a plane and, with it, a way to finally close a story that had waited in silence for generations. But Marge's rediscovery is only the beginning. Deeper in Asia's jungles, another aircraft lay missing for decades, with a story even more haunting. Number 9. The lost RKF Dakota of 1944. For more than 70 years, the high ridges of northern Burma kept a secret beneath its thick green roof. On June 1, 1944, a Royal Canadian Air Force C-47 Dakota vanished during a wartime mission with 7 men aboard. Despite a frantic search, no wreck was found, and the crew was declared MIA, listed as missing in action, leaving families with names on a list and no answers. But the tides of history took a turn in 2017 when a single photograph surfaced and changed the story completely. A villager, deep in the hills, had somehow found a battered metal bracelet and sent a picture to a World War II historian who tracks missing aircraft in Southeast Asia. The bracelet had the name H.E. Tackaberry on it, and that matched a Manitoba-born airman on the Dakota's crew list, giving researchers their first real lead since the disappearance. Working with villagers who knew the trails, a small team followed the clues and GPS coordinates from the finder until they reached a remote clearing where the jungle had slowly swallowed a plane. The scene was quiet and precise. The transport laid in pieces, its aluminum frame twisted and half-buried, with roots and vines growing through what used to be cargo doors. Careful comparison of the recovered items with wartime records gave officials confidence that Warrant Officer Claire McWilliams and H.E. Tackaberry were among those who did not return. Families were notified, and finally they had the hard answers they had waited decades for. A full recovery of the scene was impractical because the crash sits on steep, unforgiving terrain where heavy equipment cannot reach and moving remains would be dangerous. Authorities treated the site as a war grave. Local leaders placed a marker and pledged to protect it. For relatives, the discovery offered a kind of closure. Names tied to a place. Mourning moved from uncertainty to remembrance. The jungle keeps much to itself, but on that ridge, a long silence was answered. The story of the Burma ghost plane is a reminder of how war leaves mysteries scattered across the world, waiting for chance discoveries to bring them back into the light. And while this jungle gave up its secret, half a world away, the Amazon rainforest held an aviation mystery of its own. Number 8. Miracle in the Amazon. In June 2023, a single-engine plane went down deep in the Colombian Amazon. The crash ended the lives of a mother and 2 other adults on impact. 4 children were on board as well, ages 13, 9, 4, and 11 months, and somehow they survived. When a search team finally reached the wreck, they found the siblings huddled beside the twisted fuselage, hungry and dirty, but alive. The sight made everyone pause, wondering how the kids had managed to stay alive so long, alone in a place of heavy rain, biting insects, and cold, dangerous nights. Their survival came down to small, steady choices and to the practical skills they carried with them before the crash. At first, they stayed close to the wreck, understanding that the shattered fuselage offered their best chance at protection. The twisted metal became a fragile roof against the rain and a barrier that kept prowling animals at a distance during the long, black nights. They rationed what little food remained from the emergency supplies and then turned to the forest itself, testing berries, fruits, and seeds one by one, using knowledge passed down from their grandmother to know which were safe. Streams hidden beneath thick vines became their lifeline, providing clean water they collected in improvised containers. The children made a pact to stay together. The eldest kept watch while the younger ones slept, whispering stories to calm the baby when the wind rose or the insects screamed in the dark. When they had to move, they cut careful paths through the choking undergrowth, breaking branches and scratching small arrows into tree bark so they would not lose their way back. To guide rescuers, they pressed muddy handprints and carved deep marks on a wide trunk, a silent signal in the green maze. The deliberate trail simply became the clue that finally caught the eye of local trackers after weeks of relentless searching across the vast and tangled landscape. When rescuers reached the site, the children were taken for medical checks and wrapped in blankets. Local volunteers and emergency teams handled the immediate care and the slow but careful process of getting them to safety. After the rescue, the children's maternal grandfather, Narciso Mukutui, asked that they be moved to Villa Vicencio to live closer to family. This request later sparked a custody dispute with Manuel Ranocca, who is the father of the 2 youngest siblings. During the custody dispute, Mukutui accused Ranocca of domestic violence, while the older 2 children, who have a different father, stayed beyond his reach after the crash. By mid-June 2023, Colombia's Child Protection Agency was interviewing relatives to determine the best custody plan and investigating the abuse claims. Even after the rescue, big questions stayed unanswered. Officials and reporters asked what had happened before the flight, why the plane went down, and how long the children had been alone. People worried about how trauma would affect them and whether their community could support a steady recovery. Surviving the jungle was one challenge. Growing up after such an ordeal is another. The crash site remains a reminder of both loss and an unlikely survival. And the road ahead for those children will involve medical care, legal decisions, and long-term emotional support. From that green hush, our attention moves back across the map to other hidden wrecks and the discoveries they hold. Number 7. Beaufort unearthed. Willie Flynn was following a tip from a pig hunter when he and a small group hacked their way up a ridge outside Rabaul in East New Britain. The trek was brutal as they had to cross rivers, go through steep climbs and machete clearings, but at the top they found metal glinting through the mud. Scattered across the slope were propeller fragments, parts of a door, rusted gun bits, and other aircraft debris. Willie and the volunteers dug down where the cockpit lay buried under about 3 meters of silt, and pulling free, the control column was the turning point. The column, along with nearby finds, told them they were looking at a Beaufort bomber. Upon closer investigations, they uncovered human bone fragments, a leather pilot's vest still holding shape, and a watch fused to wreckage by time and corrosion. The group carefully photographed and bagged the most identifying parts and carried the control column and weapon fragments back to Rabaul for cleaning and study. David Flynn, head of the Rabaul Historical Society, helped contact aviation experts and notify the RAAF so specialists could advise on preserving the site and minimizing disturbance. Historians narrowed the possibilities to Beaufort aircraft known to have operated from Rabaul in 1943, and local elders shared wartime memories that helped place when the crash likely happened. The find brought mixed feelings: relief that a long-missing aircraft and the men who flew it had been located, and sorrow at seeing remains left where they fell. The community and the historical team agreed to protect the site and document every artifact so officials can decide next steps. The discovery shows how local knowledge, patient digging, and careful recording can turn rumors into records and give families and historians a place to start closing a decades-old story. Number 6. The fate of TANS, Flight 222 in the Andes. On January 9, 2003, a routine domestic flight ended on a remote Andean ridge. TANS, Peru, Flight 222, a Fokker F-28, registered OB-1396, was on final approach to Chachapoyas when it vanished from radar and radio. Families and controllers had no answers, so an urgent search was launched. Rescue helicopters and mountain crews scrambled immediately, backed by local volunteers and forensic teams ready to document whatever they found. 2 days later, rescue helicopters found the wreck on the steep slopes of Cerro Koepcke, around 3,450 meters above sea level. The teams battled harsh conditions from the start. Low clouds and poor visibility hid the ridgelines, while thin air and buffeting winds made every step a challenge. Carrying heavy gear across such unforgiving terrain left no room for mistakes. Forensic crews photographed and mapped the debris with deliberate care, knowing recovery had to be slow and precise. What they found was a heartbreaking sight. The jet lay torn across the mountainside, the scatter of wreckage showing what was left after the high-speed impact, and sadly, there were no survivors. Investigators recovered the flight data recorder and cockpit voice recorder, and then painstakingly replayed the last minutes frame by frame. The Peruvian accident report found that the crash was a controlled flight into terrain, mainly caused by crew mistakes, poor cockpit communication, and an early descent in low visibility. The airport had VHF guidance, but no distance measuring equipment, leaving the crew unsure of their exact position. Investigators also noted that fatigue and operational pressure likely made the situation worse. It was a clear case of negligence and nonchalance. For families, finding the plane answered the most urgent question of where it had gone. The discovery turned the mission from a search into a time of grief and questions. Local teams faced steep, unforgiving slopes that limited what could be recovered. The spread of wreckage made clear how sudden the impact had been and how dangerous mountain flying becomes when weather hides the terrain. The Chachapoya's crash reminds us that modern aircraft still face the old risks of human error and hostile landscapes. The final report was straightforward: a controlled flight into terrain during an attempted approach in low visibility, with crew procedures and situational awareness at the center of the tragedy. From that ridge, the story moves on to another remote survival tale deep in the forest. The Andes claimed many lives that day, but fate sometimes chooses a different path. In 1971, one teenage girl would defy impossible odds and walk out of the jungle alive. Number 5. Juliane Koepcke's astonishing survival in 1971. On Christmas Eve, 1971, Lanza Flight 508, a Lockheed L-188 Electra carrying 92 people, flew into a violent thunderstorm over the Peruvian Amazon. Lightning struck the aircraft, and the plane broke apart in mid-air, scattering wreckage across the forest. The disaster ended the lives of 91 people on the flight, except 17-year-old Juliane Koepcke, who was seated near the rear. Her row of 3 seats was ripped from the cabin and plunged about 3,000 meters into the canopy while she remained strapped in. She regained consciousness beneath the seat row amid the trees with a broken collarbone, a deep cut on her arm, a knee injury, and a concussion. After freeing herself from the wreckage, Juliane hiked toward water, following small streams that lead to larger rivers, the same routes the locals and animals use to move through the forest. Deep in the brush, she later found parts of the plane and 3 passengers still strapped into their seats, one of which was a woman she thought was her mother, but upon further investigation she realized wasn't because her mother polished her toes. The passengers being strapped to their seats was a grim sign the aircraft had come apart before impact. After several days, she reached a small lumberjack encampment and a hut. Juliane's survival is held up as a mix of luck, circumstance, and practical skills. Investigators and writers point out several plausible reasons, starting with being strapped to a row of seats that landed in dense foliage which cushioned the fall, updrafts inside the storm that may have slowed descent, and Juliane's upbringing at a jungle research station where she learned to recognize edible fruits, follow waterways, and treat wounds. She later helped search teams locate the crash site and recover bodies, including her mother's. Her account is recorded in her memoir and in major profiles and interviews that have revisited the case. The episode remains one of aviation's most extraordinary survival stories. Medical reports at the time documented her physical injuries, and modern coverage has emphasized the psychological and long-term impacts of surviving such an event. Number 4. Himalayan mystery solved. High on a cold Himalayan ridge, a long silence finally had an answer. On January 6, 1945, a Curtiss C-46 Commando with the serial number 42-96721 left Kunming in southern China, bound for Chabua, India, with 4 crew and 9 passengers aboard. The aircraft radioed stormy weather and then vanished. Decades of searching produced no trace until a private recovery effort led by American climber and wreck hunter Clayton Cullis found wreckage on Dafa Bum in Arunachal Pradesh in late 2021 and January 2022. The team confirmed the identity after clearing snow and reading the tail number stamped on the airframe. The site sits high and remote. Dafa Bum rises roughly between 4,500 to 4,600 meters, with its slopes cloaked in ice and thin air that can preserve metal for generations. Climbers and Lisu guides who knew the area reached the wreck after weeks of trekking through chest-deep rivers, steep passes, and freezing, unpredictable weather. Most of the fuselage lay buried under snow and ice, but careful clearing revealed recognizable structures and serial numbers that matched wartime records of the missing C-46. Though there were no human remains visible when the team inspected the site, local Lisu hunters and earlier visitors had reported seeing bones and personal effects on prior visits. However, the modern expedition found only the aircraft and scattered debris exposed by melting snow. This lack of recoverable remains reflects how harsh conditions, weather, and time can remove traces of the crew on exposed ridgelines. For families, however, the discovery still mattered. Bill Scherer, whose father, Lieutenant William Scherer, was aboard in 1945, had long sought the plane, so the confirmation gave relatives a precise location and an end to decades of uncertainty. The expedition involved careful documentation rather than large-scale recovery. Photographs, GPS coordinates, serial numbers, and on-site reports were recorded so historians and family members could match records and close the gap in wartime files. Experts noted that many aircraft lost over the hump were brought down by extreme weather, icing, and violent winds rather than enemy fire, which helps explain why the metal survived where people did not. The find closes a long mystery while reminding us how the highest places on Earth can hold stories for generations until someone with patience, local knowledge, and the right skills brings them back to light. The Himalayas surrendered their secret at last, but thousands of miles away, the Pacific still hid another riddle. Number 3. Mystery of a 9-186, resolved off Papua New Guinea. The sea keeps its own memory, but sometimes it gives pieces of it back slowly. In late 2020, a commercial dive team working for Ocean Ecology found metal shapes on the seabed about 1.4 kilometers southwest of Gasmata, Papua New Guinea, at roughly 45 meters depth. Initial dives showed scattered wreckage that matched wartime aircraft debris, and over repeated expeditions, the scattered pieces began to form a single picture. Over the next few years, specialist divers returned to the site, carefully clearing silt and marine growth and mapping every find. Sonar surveys revealed the outline of a fuselage partly buried in soft sand, while underwater photographers documented propeller hubs, wing spars, and fragments of the crew compartment. Marine archaeologists joined the effort, noting coral growth patterns and the slow corrosion that had preserved key details despite 80 years underwater. In February 2022, the team recovered a small aircraft identity plate from the cockpit area that was still readable because it had been protected in mud. This plate carried numbers that matched wartime records and turned the long-suspected find into a confirmed identification: RAAF, Bristol, Beaufort. A9-186 of No. 100 Squadron, lost in 1943 during a bombing mission against Japanese positions. Divers also noted personal effects, a corroded headset and fragments of flight instruments that hinted at the crew's final moments. Australian Defence publicly confirmed the match in April 2024, allowing historians and families to close a chapter that had remained open for generations. The fuselage lay on its side, half buried in silt and overgrown with corals and sea life. Fire damage had destroyed the engines long ago and left the site blackened in places, which explained why engines were absent when divers examined the wreck. Divers cataloged structural parts, instruments, and small personal items fused to the frame as they worked through low visibility, crocodile-prone waters, and strong currents that made each dive difficult. Bone fragments were recovered and sent for forensic testing. Modern DNA analysis matched fragments to service records and led to positive identifications for 2 of the 4 crew members, Warrant Officer Russell Henry Grigg and Warrant Officer Clement Batstone Wiggins. The Australian government and defence authorities coordinated with families and ancestral services to confirm identities and arrange memorials. The other 2 crew, however, remain on the sea floor where the wreck rests. The find resolved a decades-old gap in the record, while also raising hard questions about recovery. Authorities made the practical decision not to attempt large-scale disturbance of the site. The depth, the fire-damaged condition of the airframe, the marine environment, and the fact that the wreck is a war grave meant further recovery carried heavy safety, legal and cultural issues. For now, the site is documented, honored, and treated with respect, and families have received names and a place to remember. The Beaufort gave up its identity, and the sea gave back some of its silence. From the ocean depths to the jungle floor, a 9-186's story was finally told. Yet, in the endless sands of the Sahara, another wartime fighter lay waiting, eerily preserved. Number 2, RAF Kitty Hawk, preserved in the desert. a man walking across a sea of sand found a whole piece of war frozen in place. In March-May 2012, a Polish oil field worker named Koepcke documented a Curtiss P-40 Kitty Hawk in Al-Wadi al-Jadid in Egypt's western desert, near the El Farafra oasis. The photographs he shared showed an almost intact 1942-era fighter, its nose and wings scoured by sand, but its structure and cockpit remarkably preserved. Investigators and historians were able to link the wreck to Flight Sergeant Dennis Koepcke of No. 260 Squadron, who was reported missing after a forced landing on June 28, 1942, while ferrying the aircraft between bases. Evidence at the crash site painted a compelling picture. The aircraft type was unmistakable, and faded squadron markings still visible in photographs confirmed its identity. Even more telling was the presence of a parachute clearly repurposed as a makeshift shelter, which perfectly aligned with wartime records and strongly suggested that the missing pilot was Flight Sergeant Dennis Koepcke. Accounts from the time indicate that Koepcke survived the forced landing, used the parachute to create shade against the desert sun, and then set out alone across the sands in search of help. Teams that later searched the wider area reported finding scattered bone fragments in locations some miles from the aircraft, though none were publicly confirmed as Koepcke's. From that moment onward, he vanished into the vast emptiness of the Sahara, never to be seen again. The wreck looked more like a tomb than a crash. Koepcke's images and on-site notes show wing guns still in their mounts and ammunition boxes in place. Sand even preserved fabrics and fittings around the cockpit. Egyptian military personnel reportedly removed the weapons and ammunition soon after the plane was reported, citing safety concerns. Local people later stripped metal from the site and the airframe suffered damage, but the initial find left enough intact to tell a clear story of a forced landing followed by survival attempts. Plans to move the Kitty Hawk to Britain fell through, and the fighter was later restored and put on display in Egypt. That restoration proved controversial. Some aviation historians criticized repainting and cosmetic work that altered the aircraft's found condition. Still, the recovery and preservation effort meant the plane would survive as a public reminder of the North Africa campaign and of one pilot's lonely fate. But while the desert preserved the Kitty Hawk for decades, far away in a dense jungle, time was also hiding something far darker. Number 1. Forgotten Jungle Grave. Gunung Telapak Buruk hides its own history in a green cover that swallows sound and time. On August 23, 1945, a United States-built consolidated B-24 Liberator serving with the RAF call sign KL-654 went down on a supply mission in Negeri Sembilan, just days after the official end of World War II. The crew of 8 vanished and the aircraft dropped off maps and memory for decades. Pieces of the wreck first came to light in 1996 when an Orang Asli villager found parts of the plane and reported them to local authorities. This initial report stayed quiet until a focused local search led by amateur historians and volunteers returned to the mountain and made systematic discoveries in 2006 and later years. When searchers cleared vines and leaf litter, they did not find neat parts. Instead, what they found was a grave spread across the slope. Bones lay among twisted ribs of metal. A wristwatch had been fused to a section of fuselage by heat and corrosion, so that what had once marked time now marked a moment frozen in place. A pair of rings and a ceremonial dagger were also recovered nearby, all of which made the sight a lot more heartbreaking. Field teams photographed and carefully cataloged every artifact, mapping each piece before lifting it. Authorities treated the site as a war grave, while specialists worked to confirm identity against wartime records. Excavations continued into the 2000s, and in 2009, a dig recovered dozens of bone fragments, which local officials recorded and later handed over for identification and proper burial. Additional surveys documented the spread of wreckage across the hillside, revealing how the bomber must have broken apart as it fell. In 2012, an official commemoration took place where the recovered remains and any identified artifacts were repatriated and interred with military honors at the Cheras War Cemetery in Kuala Lumpur. This ceremony gave families and nations a formal place to remember crew members whose fates had been uncertain for more than half a century. Veterans groups, as well as the general public, joined relatives to pay their respects. The discovery turned an anonymous pile of wreckage into a named loss. Investigators matched serials and wartime flight logs to KL-654 and to the August 1945 supply mission out of Cocos Island that never completed its run. Once the wreck matched the paperwork, the find moved from rumor to record, and authorities worked with historians to document the site in case future recovery or conservation work was appropriate. For locals and volunteers who pushed through the undergrowth, the effort was more than just a history project. It was personal. They were turning old family rumors into a real place where names could be honored. They were making sure the men who disappeared into the rainforest were remembered and not lost in time. The site remains a reminder that jungles hold memory as much as they hide it. The Liberator will not be moved lightly. It serves as a grave and a lesson in how patient local research, respectful excavation, and official recognition can close long open chapters of wartime history. From that green clearing, the trail moves on, carrying with it names that were once lost and are now found. These forgotten wrecks remind us that history never truly disappears. It waits, hidden in the earth, until someone stumbles upon it. But what do you think? Should these sites remain untouched as silent graves, or be recovered to preserve their stories? And if the jungle near you held a secret like this, would you dare to uncover it? Let us know your thoughts in the comments. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and share. If you enjoyed this video, click on the next video on your screen.